of the Department of Health Systems and Services here at the Pan American Health Organization, and we are very happy that you could be here with us this morning to participate in this webinar on strengthening regulatory systems in the Americas. We are really here to participate in the launch of a landmark publication from PAHO on regulatory system strengthening in the Americas, lessons learned from national regulatory authorities of regional reference. The publication is a culmination of work executed by a committee of experts with an enormous wealth and depth of knowledge in regulatory systems and processes relating to medicines and health technologies. And we're extremely happy to have the members of the committee here with us today. A special note of welcome to all the representatives from our national health authorities and countries, especially to our regulatory authorities participating in the meeting. This publication constitutes an important milestone in the delivery of technical cooperation in this critical area of work with our member states. And a welcome also to academia, the pharmaceutical and health technology industry, to our colleagues from the development banks, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and of course, all our PAHO and WHO colleagues. Our purpose here this morning is to discuss the importance of strengthening national regulatory systems in the Americas, examining processes and practices of national regulatory authorities, in particular in 6 reference countries, taking into consideration the context of the industries and markets they oversee, current pharmaceutical regulation, trade relationships, geographical, cultural, and linguistic ties, as well as the impact of sub-regional, economic, and political integration mechanisms. We do have a full and rich agenda for you here this morning. But before we begin, a few pieces of information to optimize your participation. We do have interpretation available for you, English and Spanish, so please do select your preference at the bottom of the screen. Please also feel free to post your comments or questions in the chat and engage with us in the discussion. And so today we invite you to read, analyze, and review the publication we are launching. Our team will provide you the links to the publication in the chat. The work developed by PAHO and the expert committee received the support of the United States Food and Drug Administration, for which we are extremely grateful. The US FDA is an institution that has been a strategic and important partner for PAHO and countries in the region in strengthening national regulatory systems. Without further ado then, I would like to invite Mark Abdu, the Associate Commissioner for Global Policy and Strategy at the US FDA, to provide us with some opening remarks. Mark?
Thank you, James, and I'm delighted to be here today. I'm Mark Abdu, the Associate Commissioner for Global Policy and Strategy in the Commissioner's Office at the US Food and Drug Administration. As James noted, FDA and PAHO have a long history of working together, and I'm pleased to be here this morning, not only with Dr. Fitzgerald, Dr. Barbosa da Silva, and Mr. Antonio Brito, but also, and importantly, with my former FDA colleague and friend, Mary Lou Valdez. We're here to launch the landscaping report on regulatory system strengthening in the Americas, produced by PAHO under a cooperative agreement with the Food and Drug Administration. We chose to sponsor this project because PAHO is uniquely positioned to work with all the regulatory authorities in the region to gather and analyze the information and data that were needed for this report. We all know intuitively that national regulatory systems, play a critical role in enhancing a country's public health and bolstering its economic development. However, data are needed to help us make a compelling case for this value proposition. Thus, this landscaping report was commissioned in 2018 to demonstrate the value of regulatory systems and their strengthening by studying the current state and the process and practice of the national regulatory authorities of regional reference. These are the 8 regulatory authorities assessed by PAHO for their competence and efficiency in guaranteeing the safety, efficacy, and quality of medical products. The report being released today focuses on the current state of the national regulatory authorities of regional reference, or NRARS, that's quite a mouthful, regulatory systems of pharmaceuticals in Latin American countries. As we'd hoped, the detailed analysis pulls together current data and information about 3 areas of importance. First, the criticality of national regulatory systems. Second, the expanding manufacturing industry in the region. And third, the growing effects of science, technology, and innovation in the regulation of and access to pharmaceutical products. And this third presents challenges to all of us in the speed in which technology and science are evolving in this area. I'm not going to talk directly about the findings in the report. That's better left to our panelists, and I'm sure that there'll be a lively and informative discussion a little bit later. But I'd like to make 4 comments about the report. First, I personally found the report to be very informative. It's suitable for a wide range of audiences, such as regulators and policymakers, donor organizations, other international organizations like WHO, and industry. Second, it's encouraging to see that the 8 NRARS willingly and enthusiastically provided a wealth of data and information in support of this report. Often there's not a ton of transparency in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency of regulatory authorities. Third, as the report indicates, I'm pleased to see so much progress in the region, which implies that the effort FDA, PAHO, and others have made to increase the visibility and understanding of the importance of strong regulatory systems has been well spent. And fourth, the report opens the door for further work in cooperation and coordination between PAHO and other international organizations, perhaps the development banks, academia, and stakeholders. For example, the report talks about market outlook and presents data about production, but no discussion about its capacity or the region's capacity, which we should take into consideration to have a better idea of the investment, both economic and regulatory, to foster growth. And this is a key interest of ours, and one that we would appreciate having more information and data on. I hope that this report will be useful for regulators particularly, especially those in low and middle income countries as they seek to improve their regulatory systems and enhance their efforts to assure the safety, efficacy, and quality of medical products in their countries. I know that this is going to be a very productive and rewarding discussion. Unfortunately, I have a COVID-related commitment and won't be able to stay for the entire session. But I do send my best for a productive conversation and want to let you know my team will be listening attentively and will brief me on the discussion. Thank you, James, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And once again, our sincere gratitude for your support and the support of the US FDA in bringing to culmination this important publication. And thanks for participating in the event here this morning. I'll now move to invite Dr. Jarvis Barbosa, our Assistant Director here at the Pan American Health Organization, for his opening remarks. Jarvis is not only the Assistant Director, but was also the Chair of the committee of experts that produced this report jointly with the technical team at PAHO. So good morning, Jarvis, and over to you.
Good morning, James. It's a pleasure to be here with our team that worked very hard to have this report. This very important document belongs today. I want to congratulate everybody that has participated in this very important effort. Also to welcome my colleague, the Deputy Director, Mary Lou Valdez, that both of us had a previous life as regulators. So I think that this is especially important for us to be here today. I would like to welcome all of you to this event that marks the launching of the report on regulatory system strength in the Americas, that provides insights on the state of the regulatory system in Latin America through the experience of 6 regulatory authorities that have invested enormous efforts and resources to strengthen their systems and becoming leaders in our region. Let me start by extending my sincere appreciation to the expert committee that helped us to shape the report. Colleagues, your insightful comments, suggestions, and constructive guidance were invaluable to this initiative. This report would not have been possible without the openness and contributions of the Latin American national regulatory authorities of reference, ANMAT, Anvisa, SECMED, COFEPRIS, INVIMA, and the ISP. Thanks also to Alifar Fifarma, the Industry Association, with whom we have a long-standing collaboration, for your contributions. I must also thank the regional experts and PAHO's technical officers for putting together the report, a first of its kind. Importantly, I want to express my sincere gratitude to the US Food and Drug Administration for sponsoring this publication. The FDA's long-standing commitment and support to regulatory systems strengthening the region continues to produce bear fruit. Mr. Abdul, PAHO is grateful for your support, and PAHO hopes to continue to find collaborative solutions to help the Americas remain the leader in this area. While the study was commissioned before COVID-19, the pandemic has given us a new appreciation of critical role that regulatory systems have in public health. Regulation should remain a priority that will help revitalize our health system and economies in the post-COVID agenda. The critical role of regulatory authorities in promoting access to safe, effective, and quality-assured medicines and other health technologies is today more evident than ever. Permítanme pasar al español para hacer unos breves comentarios.
Allow me to switch to Spanish to make some brief comments on the report regarding the strengthening of the regional and national regulatory authorities in the Americas. Allow me to share a brief story with you. In 2010, the member companies of PAHO adopted a resolution strengthening of the national regulatory authorities on drugs and health technologies. This set the framework for the regulatory systems and formalized their role within the health system. The strengthening of regulatory capacity is today amongst the key priorities of the countries of the region that aspire to achieve universal health. Over these 10 years since the signature of that historic commitment, PAHO, with the support of the national regulatory authorities of regional reference, particularly with the help of the FDA, has been able to build this document with a view to the progress made through the experience of the reference authorities in Latin America. Over the last decade, the countries of the region has prioritized the strengthening of their regulatory system for drugs and other health technologies needed for public health. However, in their role to have oversight of the local pharmaceutical industry, the regulatory authorities also contribute to the economic development of the country. Following the mandate of the resolution approved in 2010, we have launched a pioneer program for the evaluation and strengthening of regulatory capacity by using a standardized tool that not only allows us to support countries to improve their systems, but also identifies the 8 authorities that regionally operate at a higher level, and for this reason have been identified as authorities of regional reference. The report highlights the importance of strengthening regulatory systems and lays out the processes and practices of 6 Latin American countries, bearing in mind the unique context of markets and producers that they oversee, as well as existing trade relations and the impact of sub-regional integration mechanisms in the dynamic between regulation and production in the region. In the report, you can see that the region has made significant progress towards the strengthening of their regulatory systems. As a whole, the 8 reference authorities in the region cover and oversee the pharmaceutical market that covers 82% of the population of the Americas, but they only represent 23% of the total number of authorities in the region. Given the impact of their regulatory strengths, and not in spite of them, these countries also have some of the most active pharmaceutical markets in the region. However, there are significant inequalities in the region. A significant number of countries with growing regulatory authorities, but have not yet reached the ideal level of operation. We hope that this report will offer countries that wish to strengthen their regulatory systems, which is key for effective and sustainable development, can benefit from this. Today, we can ask ourselves, what is the formula for efficient regulation? The report gives us guidance by going through some of the necessary elements. Despite the fact that it is not used as an only path, the reference authorities change their organizational and legal frameworks in terms of technical expertise and have a strong mandate to oversee and punish when necessary, the pharmaceutical market within their territories. In this way, they ensure quality and safety of the products in circulation. As counterpart to this, the majority of the authorities in the region that have more limited capacity have a smaller hierarchy within the national health system and vis-a-vis the highest health authority. At the same time, the stronger authorities within the region acknowledge the value of initiatives to have international harmonization, such as PIC, IFH, and IMDF, and all, to a greater or lesser degree, participate in one or more of such initiatives. It is the opening of harmonization which has made it possible to have a growing adherence to internationally recognized standards and facilitates greater trust in products exported from those markets to other countries. These standards are reflected today in the performance of various regulatory functions. For example, since segment is an installed capacity, it can review, compare, and adhere to the national standards and thus immediately adapt these to standards that emerge from these other relevant forums. The report allows us to also review the prevailing market authorization practices, clinical trials, and market surveillance, as done by the leading authorities. Reading this shows very clearly that regulatory decisions in large measures, when they use these internationally recognized practices and standards, then that is what is generally used by these reference authorities. What is even more important, however, is that many of these improvements have made it possible to introduce practices to strengthen access to health products that have a high impact on our health systems. For example, NVIMA prioritizes high health impact products, and the Institute of Public Health of Chile also conditions health registration on whether or not it can be marketed in the country quickly. Reforms of recent years have brought about improvements in other fundamental aspects. Transparency of regulatory decisions is a common practice amongst these authorities and digital publication of many of their decisions. in the era of what we're trying to have regulatory efficiency through the use of decisions made by other respected authorities, this is essential and it is considered to be a good regulatory practice. It is important to understand that this progress has inspired improvements in other areas, such as the Caribbean regulatory system and the recently created joint working system of Central America represent a regional trend towards improving regulatory capacity throughout the entire region. Regulation can have a substantial impact on the effectiveness of health products. Competition and the availability of high quality generics enhances access and competition within the market. Our report, which many of our countries, it shows that some of us are behind compared to wealthier countries that have some shortcomings in terms of access. So bioequivalence is perhaps the area in which we see the biggest difference between countries in the regular countries and the ones that have regional reference authorities. And so various countries have to do bioequivalent studies, and this varies significantly from one country to another. We see that these authorities have progressively adopted strategies of using market bioequivalence based on the criteria of health risk within these policies. For example, Anvisa in Brazil responded to the national policy to promote generic drugs and has made Brazil the country that has the largest number of certified generic products in the country. Similarly, the Public Health Institute of Chile looks at the relevance of the products in public health and public spending, as well as the availability of reference products, in addition to pharmacological criteria, applies all of this for the introduction of new requirements of bioequivalence. The new biotherapeutic products are playing an increasingly important role in public health expenditures, as well as in chronic disease therapies. These have also received tremendous attention from our authorities, who have showed a significant change in the capacity within the regulatory frameworks of the last 10 years. This has benefited the regional production of these drugs. In 2019, by that time, Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and Mexico already had national production of monoclonal antibodies. And today, these products are being exported to other countries. But there are still many challenges ahead. The manufacture of a growing number of processed products requires greater surveillance within the health system. One of the medical or counterfeit medical products in the health system throughout the world poses an unacceptable risk to public health. And the adoption of these comprehensive strategies that bring together the capacities of the regulatory authorities with policing and customs efforts is a common practice in many of these countries, but it still needs to be reinforced. The challenge of internet sales makes it even a bigger challenge, and it requires the adoption of legal frameworks and other methods to counter counterfeit products. And so these new challenges mean that our authorities have had to adopt various strategies to improve the traceability of products in circulation. For example, in Argentina, they established a pioneering traceability system in 2011 after they had a serious incident of counterfeit drugs. Market surveillance may become a potential weakness in our systems. The national regulatory authorities have increased their capacity to cover these functions and are implementing very highly organized surveillance system, and post-market surveillance tends to be less relevant in their work compared to product authorization. And they have not enough staff or budget. And people tend to focus on the quick access to the market and not the intensity of their surveillance once these products are within the health system. A glance at the budgets and the human resources assigned to health regulatory authorities show that there is room for improvement and to assign more resources to these health authorities. In the case of the national regulatory authorities of Latin America, they need to have more enforcement in recent years, and this has remained static, while the pharmaceutical market to be regulated has increased both in volume and value. Many of the authorities responded by trying to have some streamlining efficiencies, but the growing demand of the market without a doubt poses a challenge to these authorities that have limited budgets. Our markets have a growing productive capacity. The size and professionalization of the national regulatory authorities reflect growth within the production sector. So local production is increasingly viewed as a way to address high costs and high pharmaceutical budgets, and to also reduce dependence on foreign sources of essential products. The increase in local production requires greater regulatory capacity in order to look at the whole set of functions recommended by the WHO, starting with more strict border control and looking at local production, and also the monitoring of the use of markets within the products within the market. And also the increase in local drug production means that all countries are highly dependent on the importation of raw materials from other parts of the world. And not all countries have the means to have adequate control. So regulation is a good way for countries to invest in the country and in industry. An increase in regulatory capacity and the adoption of international standards could have a positive impact on the quality of local products, as well as increasing trust in them and the prospect for exporting to other markets. COFEPRIS in Mexico did not after it became a national regulatory authority of regional reference, had a tremendous increase in its sales. And also producers in Chile and Argentina and Brazil and Colombia have been able to offer their products through PAHO channels. In Argentina, they have locally produced vaccines that are being offered through the revolving fund for vaccines. And so this is a source of essential products that are not generally available in our markets and in markets of North America. Increasing trust in the regulatory capacity of the region will enhance the marketability of these products in other markets and contribute to greater access and also to the economic and social development of the region. Continuous straining of regulatory frameworks in Latin America means that the region will be more attractive for clinical research and research that is conducted every year between 2015 and 2012, the number of clinical trials conducted in Latin America increased by 12%. However, many clinical trials conducted in countries have a limited capacity of oversight. 11 of the 35 countries, that's 31%, do not have any legal provisions for clinical trials. And the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic has also required a highlight on the critical path to this. Regulatory systems play an essential role in public health emergencies. The current COVID-19 pandemic has offered the opportunity to conduct a critical analysis of the need and value of these systems in a situation of emergency, and to highlight their strengths and weaknesses, and to find opportunities for improvement in the region. This report highlights the emerging measures that authorities have applied in diverse situations since the start of the pandemic. Many of these measures are aimed at improving access to essential technologies for health response. And if we find deficiencies in regulation affect the effectiveness and quality of products needed for this emergency. And this has created tensions and pressures on our regulatory authorities. We hope that this report will feed into a productive discussion of the mechanisms that should be followed by the authorities during a public health emergency to strengthen access at the same time that they protect society in terms of the use of effective, safe, high quality medicines and health technologies. We hope that these recommendations will contribute to the technical independence of these agencies that have contributed so much to the progress in local situations. I will conclude by saying the regulatory capacity of the region has increased considerably over the last decade, but we must continue along this path because the strengthening of our regulatory system involves time and commitment, and there must be a government-wide policy that sustains it over time. National regulatory authorities must adopt a continuous improvement plans in order to not lose ground and be able to rise to growing challenges in terms of more complex health technologies and the globalized supply chain. We hope that this report will serve as a reference point for national regulatory authorities, government agencies, and a broader community of stakeholders to raise awareness and regulatory challenges that our national regulatory authorities face and can contribute to greater understanding of the skills and capacity of regulatory authorities and help identify emerging markets as well as the challenges faced now and in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barbosa, for very clearly explaining and presenting to us the complex relationship between the functions of ensuring the quality, safety, and efficacy of products within regulatory systems at the national level, at the regional level, and their association then with protecting health within the context of a pandemic, but more broadly speaking. And of course, as a central element of the social and economic development of the region. The report was, as Dr. Barbosa has mentioned, was prepared by an expert committee. And so here this morning, we would like to invite one member of that expert committee, Antonio Brito, on behalf of all the expert committee, to provide some remarks for us. Antonio is the executive director of the National Association of Private Hospitals in Brazil. So Antonio, over to you.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Jarbas. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning. And first of all, if you allow me, I would like to say how pleasant was the opportunity to work with this great team of experts and also the technical team of PAHO. This opportunity was really great. At the same time, I would like to remember that when we started to work on this report, there was no pandemic. Today, only a few months later, the world, and especially our Latin America, faces a sanitary and human tragedy. Our countries are devastated by death and by daily information about how our healthcare system must be improved if we really want to offer dignity for our citizens. It's true, as Jarbas pointed out, the system, the regulatory system, the healthcare system in Latin America improved a lot in the last years. And that's a very clear conclusion from our report. But at the same time, we know how we need to improve more and more if we really want to have an efficient and human system of healthcare. It's true, there are no new problems in our healthcare environment created by the pandemic or after the pandemic, but the pandemic is a cruel way to see our old problems. The first problem, it's an old problem, but the pandemic clarified it more, is the fact that poor countries, poor cities, poor people are always the first victims of all diseases and healthcare challenges. Once again, the figures show that only social and fair development could create the environment for an efficient healthcare system. The second and sad lesson comes from the role of innovation. As usual, the best responses for a sanitary crisis came from countries where science and technology, that means education and research, are a real and permanent priority. We were not divided between countries with vaccines or without vaccines. Our division is more deep, is between countries with or without innovation, with or without local capacity to work on healthcare, or totally dependent on external outsources. The third lesson is related to the capacity of every country to organize its healthcare system based on best practices of science, looking for the best standards to establish regulatory rules, always based on technical and scientific knowledge. Here again, as showed by Jarbas, we, fortunately, we have important improvements. But again, the report shows how and how we need to make more improvements in the next years. Here again, what divided our countries and determined more or less victims of the pandemic is the role and the power the countries offer to independent and technical regulatory authorities. Well-coordinated systems of healthcare, best integration between public and private systems, and how the whole system is protected against unacceptable interferences. This report wasn't about a pandemic crisis, but its conclusions show what we must understand after hundreds of thousands of deaths. Before the pandemic, its conclusions were an important way to ask our countries and national authorities to improve more and more their healthcare systems and especially their regulatory system. Now, in this tragic scenario, to know, to discuss, and to improve its conclusions are the best and effective way to honor everyone we lost. The report that PAHO, with FDA support, is launching is a map to do that. Let's do it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for those very frank and important words, positioning the importance of this report within the context of this pandemic. Your support as a member of the committee has been instrumental in this. I think also I would like to recognize the work of the full committee, and especially to recognize the members, Michael Arioli, Michelle Childs, Sylvia Gold, who's with us here today as well as a panelist, Alberto Gutierrez, Javier Guzman, Catherine Parker, and Kenneth Shadlin. So as with your support and all the support of the members of this committee, I think, and under the leadership of Dr. Barbosa as the chair of the committee, I think this report really will set a way forward for us to continue to build that degree of integration and strengthening of regulatory systems as we move forward. I also do want to recognize the work of the technical unit that oversaw the production of this report within the department under the leadership of Dr. Anelia Porras. As you mentioned, excellent work was done. With that, I will pass over now to our Deputy Director, Dr. Mary Lou Valdez. And Mary Lou will guide us through a panel discussion with some distinguished experts in this area from various walks of life. And so we will have some time for questions and answers, moving towards the more in-depth analysis of some of the issues that have been raised here this morning. Mary Lou, over to you.
Excuse me. Thank you, James. Let me begin, please, by also thanking the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for the support that they provided for the undertaking of the study and the publication of the resulting report. Also, a big thank you to the expert committee members who gave their time and expertise and talent to make this report really quite remarkable. And of course, we're always lucky to be under the leadership of Dr. Barbosa, who chaired this expert committee. And lastly, of course, and always to thank my PAHO colleagues whose leadership and careful shepherding of this report continues to contribute to needed public health action in the region of the Americas. So as Dr. Brito said, in a sense, this report is not to sit on the shelf, but rather we want to use this report as a tool for dialogue. And it is in that spirit that we're pulling together this panel of really quite amazing experts. So I've got a series of questions that I will ask various members of the panel and turn to them so that they can share their insight and expertise. Let me please start with our regulators, SECMED and NVIMA. I hope that you all are there. Good. The question is long, but I will do it slowly. And but I think it's really an important insight for our regulators. So the question, the report highlights existing regulatory reliance practices before COVID-19 and the opportunities to expand reliance to make regulation more efficient and effective. But COVID stopped inspections and demanded accelerated introduction of imported goods, among other challenges. Now, many regulators use reliance to cope with the response so far. With this momentum, do you think it can open a new era of cooperation and regulatory reliance, not only during emergencies, but beyond? And what are those areas that you believe would benefit most from regulatory reliance? And what do we need to do to accelerate this trend? Let me first go to Doctora Jacoba. Por favor, adelante, doctora, de SECMED.
Well, first of all, thanks very much indeed for inviting me to be part of this illustrious panel. It is a joy to be with you this morning and a privilege. But before I tackle your question, allow me to applaud the working team that has really managed to launch the document and make it real. It is a document, as we know, that picks up the efforts of many and that has enormous value, I believe, to all of our national systems. because it very sharply analyzes the 6 of the national reference authorities in this area in the Americas. It looks into how those authorities have met with their obligations, how they operate, how they have managed to better integrate themselves into the region on a whole, and the need, quite rightly, as you suggest, to create better channels to boost the trust of the peoples and the region in these respective national authorities, and how we have had to change or modify our modus operandi as necessary to face the pandemic. And from all of those analyses and the shared intent to improve, I'm sure that we, all of us, jointly and severally, have thought hard of how we can make this report come true. It is certainly an extremely valuable working document, and I'm quite convinced that it can and indeed should become part of the development plan of every national authority as a work program, honestly. Now, in the context of the pandemic, which you have raised, the trust between the public and the national authorities is clearly ever more important, and daily so. We have had to do our best quickly to face these challenges. The national authorities have had to think out of the box, come up with new ways to proceed, make our procedures more flexible, and in some, honestly, do things very differently, as we might never have done in ordinary times, if ever there are such. And of course, we know that the conditions were not carbon copies ones of the others, but they were certainly for all of us different from the norm. So the question, how to use this document and how can we continue working on these issues collaboratively between and among authorities, I think is one of the important points to underscore. And we have to do it in a context of trust. I think we need to think in terms of MOUs, of memoranda of understanding that will undergird precisely how we can cooperate, how we can spell out our actual work programs, because many of the authorities here are not yet reference authorities, but they can certainly take inspiration from those which are already recognized reference authorities, not least with regard to access to products more quickly and more safely in the countries that need these pharmaceuticals. And so I think that generating trust and doing in a very practical way things in a smarter manner that will get us the results we need as quickly as possible is the way to go. Is this easy? No. We think this document, as I said at the outset, is exceedingly valuable. And you may be sure I speak for my own regulatory authority. We're going to use this as a modus operandi, as a real roadmap for how we can proceed. And bravo to all who made it possible. And we're quite sure this will make the proverbial difference. Now, in COVID, well, of course, we've had to come up as best we could with various means of proceeding, various mechanisms that have been very trying, but I believe will stand us in good stead as we move forward. What the document says, what is recommended, I think all of it is grist to our mill. We'll be able to apply these wise suggestions in more ordinary times, and will go, as I said at the outset, to generate more trust in between and among authorities.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobo. Let me turn to INVIMA now to Dr. Judith Mestre. Adelante, por favor.
Buenos días a todos. Pues antes que
Good
nada,
morning, everyone. First of all, Julio Cesar Aldana sends his apologies. Our country is currently going through a possible stockout of medicinal gases in some regions. As you know, this is extremely important for COVID therapy, and it was so urgent that they immediately needed to put together some emergency committees to decide what measures can be taken in order to face up to that stockout. So Dr. Aldana apologizes. He has been present throughout this process. He's familiar with the report and the information that I am now going to present on his behalf so that you can here in Vima's position and the way that we are taking the recommendations from the report to heart. I also like to echo Dr. Jacobo. We fully agree with this report and its recommendations for our institute. We have already been implementing some of them, in fact. Others will be taken on board, and we are working with the global tool of the WHO, and we feel that these recommendations help us to improve and implement all of the indicators that the tool requests. Once again, congratulations. We know that this report is the result of very hard work with various countries, even amidst the high demands of the pandemic. At the same time, this is a weakness that we are turning into a strength. In our view, we would just like to say that throughout this pandemic, I want to tell you a story. At this precise moment in time when all of the countries went into lockdown, our teams auditing best practices were in India and China doing their best practices certification visits and had to run home. It is for this reason that we have become aware that the pandemic has actually helped us continue to build trust and reliance on with our regulatory authorities, our private industry, and also within our institutions, because it has become necessary for all of our national institutions to come together. We know that instilling trust is not an easy task, but for example, we've been helped by the fact that you just accept certifications of best practices so that we don't experience stockouts in products. This has been necessary. We've broken paradigms within our institute. We found some paradigms which the pandemic uh, uh, but we've been able to shatter those paradigms. So the procedures within our institute have been broken. At a certain time, we've had problems implementing them, and we've seen the need to implement in order to help make sure that products are available in the market and the public does not suffer from stockouts. So we are taking up the recommendations of the report. We feel that this improves us as an institute and as a country. In this regard, it not only helps us have access to medicines and have a high quality system that has been strengthened. Fortunately, Vima works very hard on the certification of a management system, and we have been helped by the WHO global tool. So this effort to improve quality goes hand in hand with the WHO's efforts. So for us, this has been an opportunity to take up the recommendations of the report. We have had to acknowledge in terms of trust, we have had to accept certifications from other countries. Right now, each country has its own interpretations or requirements vis-a-vis accessing certifications of good manufacturing practices, and we have expanded the landscape of countries where we have found ourselves obliged to trust in their experience and get access to these certifications. The same is true in terms of communication with these other regulatory agencies. This has gone hand in hand with our work with the WHO, and it helps us with any concerns we have in our institute or in the country. Sometimes we meet with the Ministry of Health and other institutions that are participating in the pandemic response, and this has been led by the president. The president right now, on a daily basis, looks at all of the needs of the country and brings in various internal institutions. This has also forced us internally to build trust and to have continuous communication with PAHO and the regulatory agencies in order to verify information which a few days or years ago would have been hard to get. We have come together. We're united in facing the pandemic, and it has been enabled us to put together information much more quickly. Previously, we were trying to find a certificate. You spoke directly with the regulatory agency, and now we have fluid communication. And I insist that the pandemic has forced us to free ourselves from paradigms and build trust. We know we have more work to do in this regard, and we know that the pandemic forced us to take that step, but I believe that we can continue to do so in many processes and make progress in them. Trust is essential not only for regulatory agencies, but within our institute, with other institutions, but also with industry, the private sector. So it is essential to continue strengthening this. During the pandemic, we made a major step forward, but we have to keep working on it.
Thank you, Dr. Mestre. Thank you both, our regulators who talked about
Gracias, doctora
trust,
Mestre, y gracias a las dos
communication,
reguladoras
and
que
the
han hablado
ability
de la
to use this
confianza
report as kind of a roadmap to increase our the capacity and competency. Let me turn now to our international organizations, the World Bank, Dr. Zeiter and Dr. Lumpkin of the Gates Foundation. It's really good to see both of them. Question for you, please, gentlemen. The report focuses on the experience of regulatory authorities of reference over the last decade, but it also reflects some of the innovative regional initiatives that are strengthening regulatory capacities in smaller economies. Dr. Barbosa identified two: the Caribbean regulatory system and the Central American mechanism for the joint evaluation of medicines. From your perspective, how relevant are these initiatives for the health systems and for economic development? What do the regional and global stakeholders need to do to support them? And what should these mechanisms need to do to be prepared for the next emergency? Let me start with you, Dr. Lumpkin.
Thanks, Mary Lou, and I appreciate the invitation to be here. It's great to see you again and to hear you again in particular. You know, from the perspective of our foundation, our interest in working with partners in this field of regulatory system strengthening comes from a fundamental belief that in order to have a quality healthcare system, you need to have a quality regulatory authority within that healthcare system. We tend to look at a healthcare system as, for lack of a better metaphor, a three-legged stool. You have to have quality practitioners, you have to have quality facilities, and you have to have access to quality medical products. And clearly it is within this last leg of the stool that the regulatory authority in that jurisdiction plays the critical role in helping assure that products that are available on the market to patients are indeed international quality products. I think, you know, we've learned around the world that all too often people just assume that if a product is available, it is an international quality product. And I think we know in so many cases that is not the case. And this is where the interest in building quality regulatory systems from our foundation's perspective springs. I think what this report and what your question then asks is, well, so what does that mean? How do I become a quality regulatory authority within my jurisdiction? And how do I, given the resources I have, try to fulfill the responsibilities that my citizens and my government expects of me as a regulatory authority? And I think people are being really, really quite creative. I mean, one of the best things, I think, from our perspective, has been the work of PAHO and the work of WHO headquarters to develop these mechanisms for assessing regulatory authorities. And now we have a global benchmarking tool that the global community has bought into as the method for assessing regulatory authorities as to, are they a maturity level 3? Are they a maturity level 4? Are they going to be ultimately a WHO listed authority? And the work that PAHO has done that in this report really is a lot of the foundational work that this other work has been built upon and has been incorporated into. I think when you start talking about regional mechanisms, one of the reasons we are so keen on regional mechanisms is we tend to look at Europe, for example, and say, here you've got a continent with incredible financial resources, incredible scientific resources, and yet they still, several decades ago, came to the opinion that in order to best regulate products within their continent, they needed to come together as a regional regulatory authority and figure out how to create a network of national authorities where the sum is greater than the individual components. And so kind of using Europe as an example of kind of where the world should be going in the 21st century, we have really invested with partners in the Caribbean regulatory system, for example, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, to figure out how can countries work together to pool their financial resources, to pool their scientific resources, to pool their purchasing power, to figure out how to really be the best regulatory authority for their jurisdiction they can be. And by being part of these regional approaches, I think people are finding they are better, together than individually, and forming networks of national authorities. It by no means undermines the authority of the national authority. They are the final decision maker. They are sovereign. They are responsible for what happens. But gaining access, gaining expertise, particularly when it comes to new innovative products where, quite honestly, the expertise is quite limited around the world, that you need to figure out how in a global community where we're dealing with global commodities, which these products are, how can we work smarter and better in a regional approach, as our colleagues in Europe have shown one can do. So that's kind of been our approach when it comes to supporting regional activities, not only in the Americas, but in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lumpkin. Let me turn to Dr. Zeider, please, Andres.
Hi, hello, and very nice to see you all again. Has been a while, even if it's virtual. I mean, basically, Mac, you said it all. I mean, that is a very same perspective that we are having as the World Bank. I mean, we are a broader institution that supports countries in their development, including economic development. There's a close link to human development and economic development, as we know, and we have that Human Capital Project, which is basically turning a focus on the social sectors, not as a cost to society, but an investment in the happiness and healthiness and productivity of society. So Of course, in that context, it's as Mac, as you said, I mean, medicines are a cornerstone of health systems and health service delivery, and proper regulation is critical for having a functioning medicines market. And unfortunately, many of the countries where we are working, the markets are not functioning well. No? So you have a system in which the regulator is weak, but also it's bureaucratically challenging for the companies to actually get their products on the market. And that leads to regulators just avoiding often these markets. That means that then they are exposed to imports from countries where the regulation at home is not too strong, or even where you have manufacturers of the second and third tier that somehow escape domestic regulation in order to sell their products overseas in countries where the regulation is not strong. So it's kind of a composite problem that happens there. We are in a time now where everybody's talking about domestic or regional manufacturing, in particular, looking at the shortage of COVID vaccines. So there's a big push internationally, also within our organization. Can we do more to help Africa, for example, manufacture vaccines? Yeah. So that's where I come in and say, yeah, we have been working on regulatory harmonization and strengthening for a long time. And if you ask manufacturers, they say we need a solid, sound regulatory system. We need transparency. We need predictability. And of course, we benefit from regional markets rather than having small national markets fragmented and having to go to 50 different authorities to cover one continent. So all these things kind of play together, and I'm really happy that the parties here on that call have made have put this work in action and have created this report, because it can be a blueprint for other regions as well to look at it and see, how did you guys do it? What went well? What didn't go so well? And what can we do better? So I think it's very timely, a very current piece of work. And I would say we should think about translating it into French so that, for example, Francophone African countries can read it as well. Yeah, in my view, I think this is really a direction to go. I think also maybe we can, in addition to the recommendations that were made in the report, we can add one and see, okay, can we strengthen the global network of drug regulators? Yeah? What can we do? What can WHO do and others to make the exchange between regulators even more seamless, to create platforms where informal communication can happen, but also to think about what is the best way for division of labor on a continent where you certainly have to have regulatory functions that have to be done in country and have to be done well. And what we're seeing often is that while regulators have staff and they have some budget, they are wasting most of their resources on things that already have been done elsewhere better, rather than using this as reference and focusing on their internal enforcement of rules. Yeah? So that's kind of, just to keep it short, is a little bit my takeaway and my thinking in this context. Thank you.
Thank you, Drs. Zeider and Lumpkin, speaking about regional networks and that we are better together. So I think there's a lot of good food for thought. Let me turn now to ECLAC and PAHO, Dr. Castillo and Dr. Porras. Following the old adage that form follows function, what are some of the organizational requirements for a regulatory authority to perform? If you could give us some good examples and some opportunities for improvement. And what are other requirements and commitments that we may need for sustainable regulatory systems? And with this, how would we measure performance? So Dr. Castillo of ECLAC, let me start with you.
Buenos días. No sé si me escuchan bien. ¿Sí? Bueno, en primer lugar,
I hope you can hear me, and a very good morning to you. Let me begin by offering thanks and certainly offering warm congratulations to the entire PAHO team and the expert committee for doing so much for the Americas. This document, I think, is not only timely, it is seminal, and I think it will do a lot. Coming to your question, what is, I think, most significant to underscore now is the very nature of the regulatory function in our context. We need to understand how much throughout the hemisphere there is work focusing on working more closely together on aligning our action in light of capacities, of regional capacity in terms of production inter alia. And as you've hinted, a bottom line, this is a brilliant opportunity to take another very hard look at our respective national production capacities, and then hoping and doing what is necessary to ensure that the pharmaceutical industry is strengthened in this pandemic area. It used to be that 85% of products came from imports outside the region. Well, that has got to change, and without a doubt, we know that, of course, this doesn't fall from the sky. There's been incipient capacity here and there in the general area, lot to do, but I think it bears noting that more than $11 million is generated from the pharmaceutical industry, and a big chunk of that is destined to the national markets. So when we look at the region and look to see how we can look at economies of scale in terms of production in the region, I think we begin to understand more clearly how cooperation amongst the regulatory authorities is the way to go. The report hints at this, and indeed, there are various possible options that are identified in terms of increased cooperation amongst these institutions. And there are various models of cooperation that are considered. Of course, depending on the various mechanisms of regional integration, these would have to be fine-tuned. And we see the importance, say, of SICA or CARICOM, how critical that can be, where common regulations are the order of the day, and that's all to the good. Now, in larger countries, particularly in countries that are parts of various other corporations like Mercosur or the Pacific Alliance, there again, there is room for better harmonization amongst the regulatory authorities, the national regulatory authorities. And various colleagues in the previous presentations have mentioned this. The question of good manufacturing practice becomes paramount. And in this context, I think quite pertinent. Now, we could think in terms of deepening and strengthening our regulatory agenda to begin thinking in terms of a truly regional integration mechanism, one which would have been particularly useful in moments such as this pandemic. And not forgetting, of course, our productive capacity, our ecological capacity, by the way, and certainly aimed all of this, aimed at not just the abstract, but aimed at the health sector. How do these impact the health sector? How they can make a difference to the good? And the various points that differentiate the various trade regimes in Latin America, I believe, are also a field that is rich in terms of possible examples to be derived and harmonization that could be conceived. Look at Mercosur yet again, look at the Alliance for the Pacific. We have a number of patterns that we can follow and strengthen. But I end as I began. I think congratulations are in order. I think the report is exceedingly timely, and it's clear to me also that what we see from this report is that there is more than just a hint of a regional program that is emerging. And it would include the following, I'm sure. First of all, a cogent formulation of the various productive, industrial, technological, and trade policies to be followed in the health area. That would be an enormous step forward for virtually every country, and especially those that have more road to travel. Now, that's one thing. Secondly, as we've been touching on this morning, strengthening of the regulatory authorities in the region is of the essence. We can't begin to think of harmonizing the health systems in the area without a closer look at the regulatory systems. And finally, we have to look at the demand of the various health sections and what sectors, I should say, and what the various modalities are in terms of procurement in the health sector. So we have to look at what is out there and how we can improve on it. But yet again, bravo for this event, and CEPAL is certainly honored to be a part of the team here. And we warmly congratulate our colleagues in PAHO for being the spearhead in this important sector. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Castillo. Please, Analia.
Hi, and I'm going to be very brief because I encourage everyone to read the report. It's not that long, so I think you would be able also to browse through the chapters that best serve your question. But just going back to what structure, what are our main recommendation, I think actually something that we found out that it's not a one size fits all, and there's not a single model that will work. And I go back to what Dr. Barbosa mentions, and Mac, and several of you, is that what it needs to serve is the health system. So whatever structure it best adequates to the health system needs, that's the model that should go. Having said that, there are some common characteristics that we have found of these regulatory authorities, regardless if it's a federal system like the Brazilian one, where you have a central regulatory authority with state authorities, or a single or a unitarian system like the Chilean, where one single regulatory authority serves the whole country. And I think it's best summarized by the attributes that the IOM defined in 2012 report, but also with the principles that PAHO defined in a previous report, which are some principles on cross-cutting elements. And we have heard a lot about independence. And independence doesn't mean that the regulatory authority goes on itself and just does whatever itself wants. It's, of course, it's under the structure of regulatory, of the national health authorities, but it's the technical independence that we have found out that it's key to the achievement of the goals. And the other element I would like to say is that I think it's very well reflected in the report is the hierarchy. If you have a regulatory authority that has a very low or even non-existent hierarchy within the health system, it's, as I once told a minister, is in the basement of the Ministry of Health with one person and 5 degrees of separation before the minister can sign. It's probably not going to serve your health system the best. all the regulatory authorities of reference have a high hierarchy within the national health system. They are either appointment independent of the Ministry of Health or directly appointed by the Ministry of Health or the appropriate authority. And they have direct, a level that it's at least at the level of vice minister or similar. So I think it's the hierarchy, not because of just the formality, but that actually gives the power to enforce and develop regulation that it's appropriate and in full communication with the health system. So I think we will bring back that if you need to develop a health system, first and foremost, you need the political commitment and a state policy that will be sustained in time. You need to give that regulatory authority the appropriate hierarchy, and you need to accept that you would need the political independence and technical independence in order to be efficient, swift, and be able to enforce regulation without conflict of interest and independent of you know the different political forces in the country, but first of all, more based on regulatory science. So I'll stop there. And again, I encourage everybody to read the report because I think it's a very rich section in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Analia. Last but certainly not least, let me turn to Dr. Sylvia Gold, who is president of the Mundo Sana Foundation. Dr. Gold, the question for you. The report speaks to the need to balance entry requirements and enhanced post-market surveillance. But these activities are costly, and most of the financing schemes used in the region don't seem to cost post-marketing and surveillance, and these areas seem to be less resourced than, for example, registration. Do you think we should rethink the balance between product entry, and post-marketing? And how can we ensure that post-marketing activities are well resourced? Dr. Gold, please, over to you.
Muchas gracias, Marilu. Muchas gracias a todos. Primero por la
Thanks very much indeed, Marilu. And let me begin by thanking you most sincerely for the invitation to be here. And Analia, it's always a joy to be with you and with others. It's a wonderful learning experience. And I applaud the fact that the moment has come for this important report to be launched and to become part of our public go-to researches. Now, I, in answer to Mary Lou, would like to say quite frankly that in my book, the budget should reach right across the board. Sure, the post-market evaluation was always important, but certainly in the pandemic context, we understand how very much it depends on post-market entry surveillance. You can't just let the product in and let it go and good luck. It is certainly important to let the product into the market once one has scientific trust in that product. I think what we need to do, frankly, to cut to the chase, is increase the regulatory budgets. And Dr. Barbosa said it right out of the box. We've read in the report that some of these regulatory authorities are entirely financed by the public sector. Others depend greatly on trade barriers, or I should say rather tariffs imposed on the products coming in. I think both sources of financing are acceptable. But you know what? Number one is safety. I, as a citizen, I want to be sure that when I take any medicine at all, or when I put anything in my mouth of whatever nature, that it is going to be safe. And that assurance of safety doesn't come cheap. And let's be very frank, You know, this pandemic is hitting us a great deal harder than we ever first imagined. And we have to be able to trust our national regulatory agencies because we're putting our lives in their hands. And at this point, there's our freedom vis-a-vis lockdown and our capacity to develop. And so if I want to speak now as part of the pharmaceutical industry, which I know well and of which I am a part, I want obviously to deal with products that are trustworthy, and I want to have a register, a patent, a pass, an ability to sell everywhere I can. So on the one hand, I may chafe at having to pay more tax, but if that's what it's going to take to have a register of medicine coming in that is trustworthy, I say, go for it. So I think everyone has spoken to this in one way or another. How do you do all this? Two keywords: dialogue, trust. These regulatory agencies have got to keep working together, keep talking, and trust each other. If there is no dialogue, and by dialogue, I understand as a substrate that there is trust, I don't think we're going to go anywhere, not only in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, but quite frankly, for the whole of the private sector and in my own interactions with the agencies, including the FDA and EMA, our own Argentinian agencies. I've always learned a heck of a lot in discussing with other regulatory authorities, even where at first, we felt they were holding us back and they were a little too demanding, and couldn't they just take a softer look at the thing? Well, at the end of the day, we said, you know what, it's good because many of these national authorities are really tough and they set a high bar. And so I'm saying this: we as specialists have got to demand more, and so does society. And one of the things I very much liked about this report, by the way, is the fact that the convening of this meeting has been as generous, as broad, seeking really a very wide spectrum in the expectation that anybody who had anything to say would be there to say it. So I think this is an excellent opportunity, and that dialogue/trust has always been necessary, today likely more than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gold. We're running a little bit late and I need to bring this panel to a close. I'm going to turn to my technical colleagues and hope that you'll be looking at the Q&As, that there's a number of them, and can work to address these. But I would also ask our virtual participants to please join me in applauding and thanking our panelists for sharing their ideas and expertise. Terrific panel. I feel privileged to be part of it. But now let me turn this over to you, Dr. Fitzgerald. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Marilu, for that expert management of such a very informative panel. It's, I think, the diversity of views and participants in that panel was something, I think, as Dr. Gold at the end said, really shows how important bringing all these opinions and competencies to bear on such an important issue actually is. We do have a number of questions that we will respond to. Unfortunately, we do not have time now. We will do that through a series of video interviews that we are organizing with the experts and that we will launch over the next couple of weeks. Bear in mind, as Dr. Barbosa and Dr. Valdez said, this is only the beginning. This is the beginning of a much broader process, a process by which we will continue to work with all actors in strengthening regulatory systems in the region. We've had over 450 participants in this event, in addition to those connected on YouTube. And so it really indicates the level of interest, I think, region-wide across all sectors of this important issue. With that said, I would like to hand over now to Dr. Jarvis Barbosa, who once again was the chair of the committee and our assistant director, to actually give us his final words. Jarvis?
Thanks, James. No, I think that it was a very important dialogue that we had. I think that now is the time to say that we need to use this report as a very important tool to recognize the improvements that we have had in this region in the last decade, but also as a roadmap to tell us what we need to do to strengthen the regulatory capacities in every country in this region, in some sub-regions. I think that this will be the very important role that this report will have. It's not only to document the situation, but also to guide us to the improvement and how we can strengthen the regulatory capacity in our region. Many of the colleagues that have made their statement here stressed it very clear. This is the only way that we will get safe products in the region, that we will get more access in the region, that will improve the access to medicine and health technologies in the region, and that will also improve the capacity of the region to produce the medicines, vaccines, and health technology. So I think that I want to thank you again for all the participation, the very, very important comments, and all this work. And let's hope that this report will invite all of our countries to make a reflection and to plan how to improve. The Pan American Health Organization is ready to continue supporting you through the technical cooperation and to improve also the collaboration with the FDA and the other important authorities that you have in our region. Thank you.
James, you're mute. James.
Thanks, Analia. And with those final words, thanks to you, Dr. Barbosa, Mary Lou, colleagues, everyone, a very good afternoon to you. We will continue and see you in the next event. Bye-bye.